My stepsister had her eyes on my husband, but my husband was a crazy, obsessive lover. When she once put on a bathrobe and hugged him from behind, he directly broke her arm. Do you know how much effort I put into winning Emma over? If you dare come near me again, it won't be just a broken arm. Terrified, my sister scrambled away on her hands and knees. Later, when I brought Stephen to meet my parents, my stepsister Linda kept staring at him. I knew she had already fallen for my boyfriend. This girl had been stealing from me since childhood. During one family meal, my mother's side began thoroughly investigating Stephen's background. That day, I was on my period and not feeling well. Stephen quietly went into the kitchen to make me some brown sugar water. Seizing the chance, my mom said, "Emma, your boyfriend is quite excellent, but he doesn't really match you. How about this, give Stephen to your sister. She's lively and beautiful. They'd look much better together than you and him." I laughed out loud. The nerve she had to say such a thing. Linda had been born to my mother and her later husband. She looked like her father, puffy eyes, droopy eyelids, a flat nose. At 18, she started plastic surgery. She looked better now, but the artificial traces were obvious. Seeing my lack of response, my mom grew angry. "You stubborn girl. You're the older sister, can't you be more considerate and give your husband to your sister? What a waste, raising you all these years. You're such an ungrateful brat." I was stunned by my mother's audacity. After my parents divorced, my dad sent monthly child support, but my mother hardly spent any of it on me. I never had a new outfit or toy. Neighbors pitied me and gave me their children's outgrown clothes and second-hand toys. Even my stepfather's mother secretly used her savings to help me. By 7 or 8, I was already washing clothes and cooking. Later, I worked summer jobs to pay for school supplies and textbooks. Everything I had achieved was through my own effort, but my mother treated Linda and me completely differently. She spoiled Linda rotten. Whatever Linda wanted of mine, my mom would help her take it. Thinking about it, it wasn't even surprising she'd say such outrageous words. Just then, Stephen returned with the brown sugar water. My mom and Linda quickly shut up. "The water's still hot, let me feed you," Stephen said, scooping some up, blowing on it gently, and bringing it to my lips. I felt embarrassed. There are people here. I can do it myself. But his eyes were bold. "I'm feeding my wife brown sugar water. Who dares have an opinion?" Linda forced a smile. "How could we? We're happy for sister, seeing how good you are to her. I really envy her. Just for a stomachache, her husband personally feeds her medicine. Outsiders might think her hands are broken." She was calling me dramatic. Unfortunately for her, Stephen wasn't someone who thought like normal people. He slammed the bowl onto the coffee table, his aura cold. "Are you cursing, Emma?" Linda froze as if a venomous snake had locked eyes on her. She burst into tears. "That's not what I meant. I was just complimenting you for being so good to her." Stephen snorted. "You'd better not be." Shaken, she stayed silent for a while. But watching his tender care for me, her envy only deepened. "Brother-in-law," she suddenly cooed, "I'm also on my period. Could you make me a cup of brown sugar water too?" I got goosebumps all over from her sickly sweet voice. Stephen laughed coldly. "Are your hands or feet broken? Can't you make it yourself?" Linda pouted. "But didn't you make it for my sister? Emma is my wife. What are you?" His voice was sharp. "Do you really think you're worthy?" Humiliated, Linda covered her mouth and ran to her room. I sipped the drink Stephen fed me, savoring both his attention and the show. He was truly a tough nut to crack, not someone Linda could manipulate easily. After some time, Linda composed herself and came back out. Seeing only me in the living room, she glared resentfully. "Emma, don't get too cocky. I stole your design work once, and I can steal your husband now." "Oh, you can try," I said lightly, though my mood wasn't calm. Back in freshman year, I had wanted to study architecture abroad. I drew many designs to submit to a top overseas design school. Linda stole them and submitted them under her name. She got into my dream school while I stayed behind. But Linda had no real skill. Without my designs, she was nothing. She delayed graduation for 2 years before barely scraping through. It was my life's biggest regret. If it weren't for Linda's grandmother being kind to me, I'd never want to see the Wilson family again. But now she lived with her younger son, so she wasn't here. "What are you talking about?" Stephen's voice suddenly came from behind me. Linda jumped, but then plastered on a sweet smile. "Brother-in-law, I just graduated and haven't found a job yet. Since you own a design firm, could I intern there?" Stephen looked at her for a long moment, then replied flatly, "Of course. No problem." She squealed, "Brother-in-law, you're so good, I love you." Stephen's smile was cold. "It's what I should do." But Stephen already knew how Linda had sabotaged me years ago. Disaster was waiting for her. The next day, Linda dressed up like a peacock and arrived at work. When Stephen and I walked in, we overheard her chatting with new colleagues. "This company is so hard to get into," she said proudly. "Luckily, I have a special relationship with Stephen." The colleagues perked up. "Special? How special?" She blushed theatrically. "Oh, stop asking. Stephen values privacy, so he doesn't want our relationship known." She managed to say nothing while implying everything, misleading them into thinking Stephen was her boyfriend. Her colleagues exchanged glances, but their expressions shifted to disdain. Because as Stephen's obsessive lover, he had already made our relationship public the very first day I joined the company. Stephen's words lingered in the air like the sound of a closing door, final and merciless, leaving Linda pale as she forced a laugh to cover her embarrassment in front of the new colleagues. I watched her closely, hiding my satisfaction behind a calm expression. She thought she had managed to deceive others with her fabricated charm, but she underestimated Stephen. He was not just an obsessive lover, he was a strategist, a man who never forgot and never forgave. I had seen it in his eyes the first time we met. That same cold intensity that terrified others had been the very thing that drew me in. To him, loyalty was sacred, and betrayal was punishable. Linda was about to find out just how high the price of betrayal could be. That evening, after work, Stephen and I returned home. He placed his jacket neatly on the hanger and came to sit beside me on the couch. His hand brushed over mine with casual tenderness, but the sharp glint in his eyes betrayed his thoughts. "Emma, do you remember the design she stole from you?" His tone was calm, but it carried an underlying weight that made me straighten in my seat. I nodded. "I will never forget. That was my dream, Stephen. She took everything I worked for and destroyed it in one move." His jaw tightened, and he lifted my hand to his lips, kissing it as if sealing a vow. "She will pay for that. Slowly. Thoroughly. I will make sure she tastes the bitterness of every stolen opportunity." The next few days at the office were like a game of chess. Linda, dressed in expensive clothes and perfume that couldn't mask her insecurity, strutted around as though she belonged. She smiled sweetly at everyone, dropping Stephen's name in casual conversations, insinuating a closeness that didn't exist. The more she tried, the more isolated she became. Stephen didn't even look at her except to give her cold, clinical instructions. Colleagues began whispering, some mocking her behind her back. I watched her confidence chip away bit by bit. One morning, Stephen called Linda into his office. I stood outside the glass wall, pretending to go through papers, but my ears strained to hear. His voice was calm but carried a chilling authority. "Linda, do you understand what we do here?" There was a pause, then her overly sweet tone replied. "Of course, brother-in-law. I studied design too, remember? I can handle it." Stephen leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile curving his lips, one that never reached his eyes. "Good. Then I'll give you a project. Prove yourself." Linda came out of the office beaming, carrying a thick folder. She walked straight past me without a word, though her eyes held triumph as if she had finally won something. I knew Stephen better than she did. That project wasn't a gift. It was a trap. Later that night, while Stephen worked late in his home office, I brought him a cup of tea. His desk was littered with documents, sketches, and a glowing laptop screen. "You gave her a real project?" I asked. His lips curled into a cold smirk. "Not just real. Crucial. If she fails, the entire team will see her incompetence. If she tries to steal again, I have already secured every design with time-stamped files and internal records. She will have nowhere to run." Weeks passed. Linda tried her hardest, but the cracks showed quickly. She didn't understand the depth of the work, nor the creativity it demanded. She begged colleagues for help, trying to charm them, but most turned away. Rumors spread that she wasn't fit for the role. By the time the client presentation arrived, Linda was a bundle of nerves. That morning, the conference room was filled with the hum of conversation. Stephen entered with quiet authority, Linda trailing behind clutching her documents. When it was her turn, she stood trembling before the clients. Her slides were messy, her explanations shallow. The clients exchanged glances, unimpressed. Stephen sat still, his expression unreadable, until one of the clients asked a pointed question. Linda froze. She stammered, then looked toward Stephen for help. He didn't move. Instead, his voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Emma, why don't you explain it?" I rose slowly, walking to the front. I had been working in the background on the same project, perfecting every detail, anticipating this exact moment. With calm confidence, I explained the design, breaking down the concepts, addressing concerns, and presenting solutions. The room transformed from skeptical silence to nods of approval. The clients applauded when I finished. Linda's face drained of color as the reality sank in. She had been set up not by accident, but by design. Stephen stood and shook hands with the clients, his words firm. "You see why my wife leads our design team. The word wife struck hard, leaving no room for Linda's delusions. After the meeting, Linda followed me into the hallway, her eyes red with rage. "You planned this," she hissed. "You wanted to humiliate me." I met her glare with calm composure. "No, Linda. You humiliated yourself. You can't steal your way into talent. Without substance, everything collapses." Her fist clenched, but before she could lash out, Stephen appeared. His presence alone made her flinch. "If you have time to waste on tantrums, then you should resign," he said coldly. Linda's lips trembled. "Brother-in-law, please, I can do better. Just give me another chance." Stephen's expression didn't change. "You had your chance." He turned his back, dismissing her completely. That night, Linda didn't come home. My mother called me in tears, accusing me of being heartless. "She's your sister. How can you let her suffer like this?" She told me you and Stephen humiliated her in front of everyone. Do you know how much she cried? I felt the old bitterness rise in my chest. "She is not my responsibility, Mother. You chose to spoil her while I starved. Now she's tasting the life she earned." My mother gasped, then shouted, "Ungrateful child. I should never have raised you." I hung up, shaking but resolute. Stephen took the phone from my hand and set it aside. "Stop letting their voices hurt you," he said softly, pulling me into his arms. "They don't deserve a single thought from you." The following weeks grew darker for Linda. She clung to the company like a shadow, but everyone saw her differently now. She was no longer the pretty girl with charm, she was the fraud who had tried to deceive them. Each whisper, each dismissive look cut her deeper. She started making mistakes, arriving late, forgetting tasks. Stephen ignored her existence entirely, his coldness sharper than any insult. One evening, as Stephen and I left the office, we passed the lobby and saw Linda cornered by a group of colleagues. They were mocking her, laughing at her exaggerated lies about her so-called closeness with Stephen. I expected her to fight back, but instead, she broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. For a brief moment, guilt tugged at me, but then I remembered every stolen design, every cruel word, every time she had tried to take what was mine. My heart hardened. At home, Stephen poured himself a drink, his eyes thoughtful. "She won't last much longer," he said. "But before she leaves, I want her to face the truth. Not just about her incompetence, but about the past." I tilted my head, curiosity sparking. "What do you mean?" He leaned closer, his lips brushing my ear. "I have the evidence of her theft. The original designs, the timestamps, the school records. When the time comes, we'll expose her. Not just to the company, but to the world." His plan was ruthless, but a strange sense of justice stirred within me. For years, I had carried the regret of lost opportunities. Maybe now, I would finally reclaim what was mine. The storm was brewing, and Linda didn't even know she was standing in its path. The week after the client presentation felt like the calm that fools sailors into thinking a storm has passed. Linda arrived at the office in impeccable makeup and a new coat, as if a fresh layer of paint could seal the cracks that had widened in public view. She walked taller than before, but the smile in her eyes did not hold. It wavered and slipped when a colleague turned away mid-sentence, when a manager answered her with a clipped yes, when the receptionist greeted me with warmth and only nodded at her with a professionalism reserved for strangers. I thought she might take a hint and leave, that pride would rescue her before the truth did, but Linda had never learned how to retreat. She only knew how to grasp harder. Stephen began to reorganize the design floor with a steady hand. It was the kind of quiet restructuring that looks like routine maintenance until you notice how deliberate the timing is. Teams were shuffled. Access permissions were updated. The archive servers were audited. The new compliance officer, a woman named Camille with a voice that never rose above calm, walked from desk to desk asking for sample workflows and asking who approved what and when. People grumbled for 2 days and then stopped, because they could sense this was not a fad. It was a new spine in the company's body. One night I stayed late finishing a materials board in the small library that Stephen had built for us when we moved into the duplex. The shelves held fabric swatches and wood samples and little glass bottles with sand from construction sites that had become memories. He came in quietly and placed a glass of warm water by my hand. His tie was loosened and the hair at his temple was damp as if he had rinsed his face to wash off the day. He sat on the edge of the table and watched me work for a minute, saying nothing, that intense stillness of his wrapping around me like a coat. I looked up finally and said what he already knew. "You move the compliance net because you expect her to make another grab." He nodded once. "Thieves repeat what worked until it does not. She cannot build. She can only take. If you give a thief nothing to take, she will try to pry up the floorboards." He placed his palm over my open sketchbook and then drew it back, a small silent promise that he would not interfere with the lines that were mine. "When we go public with this," he said, "we go all the way. There will be a complete record. We will not shout. We will show." The next morning an email slid into my inbox from the registrar of the overseas school that had once been my dream. The subject line was dry request for clarification. My chest tightened. The message asked whether I could confirm authorship of a set of freshman portfolio drawings that match work published in our company's newsletter last quarter. Attached were low-resolution scans bearing my old signature, the one I had practiced as a teenager when I still curled the tail of the A. There was a note at the end, polite but sharp, that the school had received an anonymous inquiry suggesting a certificate review for one alumna. I stared at the words until they blurred, then forwarded the email to Stephen without comment. He answered in less than a minute "Bring everything to my office." On the way there my phone buzzed. It was my mother. Before I could speak, her voice hit me like wind through a cracked window. "Emma, your sister is sick with shame. Why are you doing this to her? She is young. One mistake, is that worth destroying her future?" My throat burned. One mistake, repeated for years, threaded through my life like wire, binding and cutting. Stephen stepped into the hallway at that exact moment and took the phone from me, pressed the speaker button, and spoke in a voice that could have frozen water. "Mom, this is Stephen. Your daughter will not call here again unless she is prepared to speak respectfully. There will be a formal review of academic records and professional conduct. Interference will not change that." My mother sputtered with outrage and then delivered her old verdict: "You are an ungrateful child and a bad influence on men." The call ended with a tiny digital click of defeat. Stephen handed the phone back, and for a moment I hated that I needed the shield he made of himself. Then I remembered how it felt to sew my own school skirt by hand at 13 because there was no money left after plastic surgery consultations, and the shame cleared like smoke from my lungs. That afternoon Camille asked me to walk her through the original architecture portfolio that had been stolen. I went to our storage room and opened a battered cardboard box that had not been opened in years. Inside were notebooks with bent spines, pastel dust still clinging to corners, tracing paper curled at the edges, a small envelope with international postage that I had never mailed because by the time I found the courage, the chance had already been taken from me. Camille set everything out on a long table under white light and photographed each page with a dated camera that printed a tiny timestamp on the side. Stephen came in midway through and stood across from me, reading my notes like they were poetry he had been waiting to hear. For the first time, the pain of those drawings was matched by something else, a steadiness that felt almost like pride. The lines were not perfect. The vision was young. But the hand was mine. The first real sign that Linda felt the trap closing came 3 days later. I returned from a site visit to find my monitor on, my chair a few inches off from where I always left it. Nothing was missing. Nothing obvious at least. But in the version control logs there were 2 attempts to download a full project folder at 2 in the morning from a temporary badge. Camille pulled the building access records. A maintenance door had been opened without a registered maintenance event. She printed the footage from the security camera at the freight elevator. The woman was covered in a hoodie, head down, but when she fumbled her phone, the light from the screen flashed across her face. It was Linda. Stephen watched the footage without blinking. "Do not confront her yet," he said. "She is not done. We need intent and pattern, not a single night of stupidity." Camille nodded. She had the calm of someone who had seen 100 versions of the same mistake and none of them surprised her. She drafted a quiet memo to the legal team and began a paper trail that did not accuse, only recorded. I slept badly that night. In my dream I was standing in the old kitchen and my mother was taking the last egg from the carton to fry for Linda while I tried to whisk water with air and pretend it could turn into breakfast. Stephen woke when I did and pulled me close. "Tell me," he said, and I did, all of it, the light in the window at dawn when I went to my first job before school, the sound of their laughter behind a closed door, the way the mailman looked at me with pity when he handed over envelopes with my father's support payments. He said nothing but his arms tightened, and I felt that fierce possessiveness of his, the one people call control, turn into a shelter around me. The city announced a design showcase for a new civic arts center in the old warehouse district, a project that would attract press and donors and the kind of eyes that could change the trajectory of a firm. Stephen decided we would present a concept not as bidders but as leaders, as a model of what public space could be if it were built for ordinary people who never feel invited. He put me in charge of the vision deck. When I suggested bringing 2 junior designers to shadow me, he agreed at once and then added Linda to the distribution list with the pleasant neutrality of a boss who sees all his employees as resources. I knew what it meant. Give a desperate thief something bright and she will reach for it even if it burns. We worked late the night before the showcase. The office hummed with a low energy of concentration. At 11 I told the team to go home. Camille stayed, pretending to review a procurement log, but I could tell she was waiting. Near midnight, I slipped into Stephen's office to rest my eyes for a few minutes on the small sofa. I woke to the soft creak of a door. Through the glass wall I saw a figure move between cubicles, slow and careful. Linda paused at my desk, glanced over her shoulder, then slid a flash drive into the port. She copied the presentation folder, then replaced the final render files with earlier drafts that had known issues. When she moved to leave, Camille stepped from the shadows with another security officer at her side. The camera in the corner blinked its little red light like a heartbeat. Linda froze. For a moment she looked almost relieved, as if being caught was easier than holding her breath for one more minute. Then she saw me standing behind Camille and panic returned like heat. It was not a loud confrontation. Camille simply asked her to hand over the drive and her temporary badge. Linda tried to smile. I was just backing up for safety. Camille nodded. Of course. She took the drive, placed it in a clear bag, wrote a time and date on a form, and asked Linda to sign a receipt. Linda hesitated, then scrawled her name. Stephen emerged from his office at the end as if he had been asleep in a chair, which he had not been. He looked at Linda with a neutrality I had never seen on his face. There was no anger. Only decision. Go home, he said. There will be a meeting in the morning. She opened her mouth as if to plead and then closed it. She left without looking back. At 8 the next day, she arrived with my mother. They sat in the glass conference room under the company's logo, my mother in a floral blouse that made her look softer than she was, Linda with her eyes swollen from a night of crying. Stephen entered with Camille and 2 board members. I joined them with a small folder. My mother began at once, voice quivering with practiced despair. My child made a mistake because she was desperate for recognition. She was jealous of her older sister who is everything. Please, as family, let this pass. You are a man, you should be generous. Stephen did not sit. The evidence will be reviewed, he said evenly. This is not a family matter. This is theft of company property and sabotage of a public presentation. There will be consequences. He nodded to Camille. She set a screen on the table and played the footage from the previous night. Then she brought up the access logs, the download records, the metadata on the file edits. The room was quiet except for the small sounds of paper sliding and keys tapping. When the last still image froze on the screen, my mother folded her arms as if cold and then went on the attack like she always did when pleading failed. Emma put you up to this, she said, pointing at me with hands that had never washed my uniforms. She hates her sister. She is jealous of her beauty. She wants to ruin her. I took a breath and slid my folder across the table to Linda. It held the scans from the registrar, photographs of my original drawings, and copies of 2 emails I had found on an old account showing timestamps from the week my portfolio disappeared. The subject lines were simple file review and application draft. The body text carried Linda's turns of phrase and a claim of authorship. Linda looked at them and then looked away, as if the pages were too bright. Stephen spoke quietly. I also have a statement from Professor Hale, who supervised that cohort. He remembers that the portfolio style of one student shifted abruptly mid-year to a voice inconsistent with her earlier submissions. He remembers because he questioned it at the time. The board member on the left, a woman who had started as a laborer before launching her own practice, closed her eyes for a moment as if remembering her own first stolen idea. When she opened them, they were hard. Miss Wilson, she said to Linda, this company cannot trust you with a screensaver, much less a client. You will leave now. Legal will contact you. Security is at the door. My mother rose in a flurry, knocking a pen to the floor. You will hear from our lawyer, she snapped. Stephen answered in a tone that did not rise above polite. We already have. They were escorted out. The room exhaled. I stayed seated as if gravity had doubled. Stephen slid his hand across the table and rested his fingertips on mine. Not to possess. To anchor. There is one more thing to do, he said. We cannot build your future on a quiet, private healing. We have to set the record straight in the world you were kept from. Which is why I invited a guest to lunch. He stood and opened the conference room door. An elderly woman in a navy coat stepped in, small and straight-backed, eyes bright. It took me a beat to recognize her. My stepfather's mother. The woman who had once slipped coins into my coat pocket when she thought I was not looking, who had taught me to stitch a seam straight, who had given me, without words, permission to become something my mother did not choose for me. She held a paper bag to her chest like a treasure. I thought I would not live long enough to make this right, she said in a voice that wavered but did not break. She opened the bag and took out a slim notebook wrapped in a handkerchief. Inside were photocopies of the drawings that had vanished years ago. On the back of each page was a note in her tidy handwriting where and when she had found it. She had copied them at the print shop where she volunteered and kept the copies in a tin in her closet because she had seen Linda sneaking out with the originals and had been afraid to confront her without proof. I told your mother, she said, but she said girls fight over silly things and I should not make trouble. I am sorry, Emma. I should have made all the trouble in the world. My eyes burned and for once I let the tears come because this was not defeat, it was release. I took the notebook and pressed it to my chest. Stephen thanked her with the kind of respect he rarely showed anyone. He arranged a car to take her home, asked her favorite bakery, and had it deliver enough bread to fill her kitchen. Later that afternoon he sent certified copies of the notebook to the registrar and attached a formal letter requesting a review of the degree granted to Linda Wilson for cause, with a full archive of supporting documents, signed by the firm and the professor who had suspected her. He did not threaten. He did not plead. He simply laid out a record like a set of stairs and invited the world to walk up. The showcase arrived on a clear Saturday morning. The warehouse smelled of paint and coffee. Design boards lined the brick walls. Students with bright eyes asked careful questions. Donors wandered in small clusters like schools of fish, turning together whenever something shiny caught the light. I wore a simple black dress and the first pair of new shoes I had allowed myself to buy without guilt. Stephen moved through the room with the alert calm of a man guarding a perimeter and a heart at once. When our time came, I stepped onto the small stage, took the microphone, and breathed. I told the story of the site, of the people who lived within walking distance, of the invisible borders that make public space feel private to those with money and off-limits to those without. I showed our concept for a central hall that opened like hands, a roofline that collected rain for a community garden, a series of small maker rooms with doors that slid wide enough for a wheelchair and a dream. I did not use metaphors. I used measurements and light. When the applause began, I heard a familiar voice at the back trying to rise above it. It was my mother. Linda stood beside her with a bandage on her wrist like a memory, eyes glassy with the same old mixture of regret and calculation. They had come to make a scene. Stephen turned before I could react. He did not touch them. He did not raise his voice. He simply motioned to security and then to the event coordinator and said the one sentence that closed the door on a decade of chaos. These guests are not on our list. Please escort them out. They shouted the usual slurs, ungrateful daughter, witch, liar, and then they were gone, their words thinning as the doors swung shut. The donors looked at me with questions, and I looked back with a steady gaze that answered them. Yes, I am fine. Yes, we build despite noise. By the end of the day, the Arts Center committee asked if we would consult formally. The press printed photos of the models and quoted one line from my talk about doors and dreams. Stephen did not smile in the pictures, but he looked at me in one of them with such naked pride that it felt private. We went home in a car filled with foam core and notebooks and a quiet that did not need to be filled. He made me ginger tea and set my shoes aside like artifacts. I lay on the couch and stared at the ceiling and felt something loosening in my chest that had been tight for years. The email from the registrar arrived the following week. It was brief: a formal review has been opened. We request any additional documentation. There was no promise of outcome. Institutions move like ships, they turn slowly if they turn at all. But there was movement, and it was not away from me. Stephen forwarded the letter to legal and then sent a single-line message to Camille: thank you. She answered with the smallest smiley face she would ever risk sending from a work account and went back to building the quiet scaffolding that kept the company upright. Linda, meanwhile, changed tactics. She posted a long note on social media claiming she had been harassed at work, that her brother-in-law had pursued her, that she had rejected him nobly, that I had grown jealous and orchestrated her downfall. She implied, without saying, that there were messages she could release if provoked. Her followers, mostly people who loved the curated images of her face, flooded the comments with sympathy. For a day my hands shook. Not because I feared what she would show. There was nothing. But because lies in the right font can move faster than proof. Stephen saw the post, looked at me, and said we will not swim in that water. Then he called our counsel, who sent a demand for retraction with screenshots of her download attempts, a list of witnesses to her boasts about a special relationship, and a declaration signed by every member of my team regarding the night she was caught. The letter was posted publicly on the company site with a simple statement: we protect our work and our people. The story died not because the internet repented but because it got bored. One evening near sunset, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find my father on the step, hair grayer, eyes softer than I remembered. He held a small box. I heard, he said simply. I am late, I know. I did not fight hard enough back then. I thought sending money was enough. It was not. I opened the box. Inside was a mechanical pencil with a tiny engraved line along the clip, the kind architects buy when they feel they have earned it. He cleared his throat. I kept this for when you would need it. I waited a long time. Stephen stepped up beside me, not possessive, only present. I invited my father in and we sat at the table and talked like people trying to learn a language that should have been theirs from the beginning. It did not fix the past. But it sketched a bridge over it. The next morning a courier delivered a stiff envelope addressed to Stephen and to me. Inside was a notice of intent from a rival firm funded by a developer with a reputation for breaking neighborhoods into saleable pieces. They alleged that our Arts Center concept infringed on a draft they had submitted to a private competition 2 years earlier, a draft that looked like a skeleton version of what we had presented. It was nonsense, but it was aggressive, and it was timed. Someone had passed our deck along a chain of grudges until it reached a hand willing to throw it like a stone. Stephen read the letter and the muscle in his cheek jumped once. Then he set it on the table as if he were laying down a napkin before dinner. They want to bury your wind and noise while the school review is open, he said. They want you tired. I touched the sleeve of his shirt, felt the tension there, the protective fury of him settling in like armor. I'm not tired, I said. I am ready. He looked at me then with the intensity that had first frightened me and later had become the truest thing I knew about him, that unstoppable force that, when aimed at the right target, could move a mountain. Good, he said. Because the final act is not them and not Linda and not your mother. The final act is you walking through the door they tried to close and putting your name on it in letters no one can rub off. He reached for my hand and laced our fingers together. We will answer the letter. We will finish the Arts Center contract. We will send the last notarized package to the registrar. And then we will build something so clean that no one can pretend not to see it. That night I spread new sheets of paper on the dining table and began to draw. Not to prove anything to anyone. To breathe. Lines for a small library room with windows low enough for children to look out of while they read. A bench along a wall with outlets where teenagers could charge their phones without sending a message that only some kids are welcome. A quiet corridor where older neighbors could walk without fear of a scooter at their ankles. Stephen sat across from me and watched, elbows on the table, chin on his hands, as if my drawing were a city coming to life. We worked until midnight, stopped for toast and jam in the little kitchen, and then worked again. When I finally put my pencil down, the page was full and my heartbeat was even. Near dawn my phone buzzed with a message from Camille. The registrar scheduled an interview regarding the review. They are taking it seriously. Also, we have a meeting set with counsel about the rival firm's claim. See you at 9. I stared at the screen and felt a strange stillness settle over me. The storm was here. But I was no longer a girl whisking water with air. I had heat now. I had flour in a pan and hands that knew what to do. I looked at Stephen. He nodded once, the smallest of smiles in his eyes, and said what he always said before stepping onto a battlefield that others thought belonged to them. Let's go take back what is ours. The registrar review date arrived on a gray morning, the kind where clouds hang low like damp wool and the streets smell faintly of rain before it falls. Stephen and I walked together into the stone building of the university where Linda had once paraded her stolen achievements. The corridors were lined with frames of smiling graduates, faces beaming with the confidence of futures they believed were theirs. I wondered how many of them had suffered quietly as I had, carrying the weight of a theft no one believed. My palms sweated but Stephen held my hand firmly, grounding me as if he were saying without words you are not that abandoned girl anymore. Inside the conference hall, a panel of 3 administrators and 1 external professor waited. They offered professional smiles, polite nods, the kind of neutrality that hides judgment until the right moment. Linda sat at the far end with a lawyer at her side and my mother behind her, lips pressed thin, eyes darting at me with contempt and fear blended together. I took my seat opposite, Stephen on one side, Camille on the other. The chairwoman began with a recitation of procedure. The purpose of this review is to determine the authenticity of academic submissions associated with the degree awarded to Linda Wilson, she said. Evidence has been submitted by both parties. We will hear statements and examine documents. Linda's lawyer stood first. He was smooth, practiced, and immediately began weaving a narrative of jealousy between sisters, of family conflict spilling into academic mudslinging. He argued that any similarities between my old sketches and Linda's portfolio were coincidence, that teenage students often imitate styles, that no theft had occurred. He ended with the assertion that dragging a family quarrel into the university decades later was unfair to a successful alumna. Linda tilted her chin up proudly at his words, as if she could still convince herself that confidence equaled truth. Then it was my turn. My voice trembled on the first word but steadied as I laid out the sequence of events. I explained how I had drafted the designs, how they vanished, how Linda had been accepted into the program I had dreamed of. I placed the photocopies from my stepfather's mother onto the table, each page stamped and dated from years before. I handed over the registrar's own scans with my early signature, the one that matched the notes in my original sketchbooks. Camille displayed the version control timestamps from our firm, proving my style and authorship over time. Finally, Stephen read aloud the letter from Professor Hale, affirming that he had suspected dishonesty years ago, but lacked evidence then. For a long moment the panel said nothing. Papers shuffled, pens tapped. Then one professor leaned forward and asked Linda directly why her early assignments bore one style and her later portfolio another. Linda hesitated, her tongue caught between answers. She muttered something about artistic growth, about practice and mentorship, but her voice faltered when the professor pressed her again, this time with the copies side by side. The room grew still, and for the first time in my life I watched Linda shrink instead of expand. The mask cracked. The decision was not given immediately. They said it would take time, that the integrity of the institution required full diligence. But when I left the hall I already knew the tide had shifted. My mother hissed at me as I passed, ungrateful child, ruining your sister. But her voice sounded brittle, her words bouncing off armor I had grown through years of scars. Stephen's arm around my shoulders told me everything. Whether the university stripped Linda's degree tomorrow or in 6 months, her illusion was collapsing. Truth does not always move fast, but once it starts it does not stop. Outside, rain had begun to fall. Drops clung to my hair and cheeks. For the first time the cold did not feel cruel. It felt like cleansing. Stephen tilted his face upward for a moment, then leaned close to whisper, "We are almost at the end." I nodded, my chest lighter than it had been in years. The rival firm's legal claim came next. They pushed aggressively, sending letters to clients, hinting to donors that our art center design was plagiarized. It was a tactic to stain our reputation. But Camille and Stephen dismantled their accusations piece by piece. Our files showed clear timestamps, process photos, internal approvals. More importantly, our design was rooted in a philosophy of community access, while theirs was a sterile corporate plan with no relation to our vision. At the hearing, Stephen stood calmly, presenting each fact like a stone laid on solid ground. The opposing counsel grew redder with each point, their arguments unraveling until even the board overseeing the dispute looked irritated. By the end, the claim was dismissed, and the rival firm's attempt at sabotage backfired, damaging their credibility instead of ours. When the news reached the press, journalists dug deeper. They discovered Linda's social media posts, her false claims, the inconsistencies in her career. Stories began to appear not about me but about her deception, her manufactured beauty, her fabricated talent. Sponsors quietly withdrew. Influencer partnerships dried up. She went from being praised to being whispered about as a fraud. My mother tried to defend her online, but the internet is ruthless. Their words turned back on them, mocking their desperation. For once I did not feel pity. I felt release. The Arts Center project blossomed. Our presentation was chosen as the official design model, and we were commissioned to lead development. Donors pledged funds. Local leaders expressed gratitude. The warehouse district that once smelled of rust and silence would become a hub of light and laughter. I walked through the site one evening as construction prepared to begin, and I ran my hand along the rough brick walls. I thought of the girl I once was, stitching her school skirt alone, and whispered to her, "You made it here. You are not invisible anymore." Stephen never softened in his vigilance, but he smiled more often now, small rare smiles that only I saw. He would watch me lead meetings, present to officials, sketch late into the night, and his eyes would hold a kind of reverence that even I found difficult to accept. Sometimes I would tease him, "You look at me as if I hung the stars." He would answer, "You are my stars." It was possessive, yes, but it was also true. He had chosen me not just as his wife but as his partner, and together we had built something no one could steal. The final blow to Linda came quietly. Months later, the registrar issued its decision. Her degree was revoked for academic dishonesty. The letter was clinical, without malice, but it might as well have been thunder. Her lawyer withdrew. Opportunities vanished. Employers no longer returned her calls. She attempted to reinvent herself online under new names, but the stain of exposure followed her. My mother blamed me publicly until her voice lost its audience. They faded into the background of my life like noise from a house I no longer lived in. On the day the art center opened, children rushed across the polished floors, their laughter echoing under the roof I had designed. Elderly neighbors sat on benches, their eyes wide as they realized this place belonged to them too. Teenagers plugged their phones into wall outlets while chatting, unafraid. Volunteers guided visitors through studios filled with light. I stood at the entrance, watching the stream of people, my heart heavy and light all at once. Reporters asked me how it felt. I said simply, this was always meant for the people outside the door. Now the door is open. Stephen stood beside me, his hand warm at my back. He spoke quietly so only I could hear. "This is the future you were meant to have. Not stolen, not borrowed, but built." I turned to him, tears in my eyes, and whispered, "Thank you." He shook his head, "No. Thank yourself. I only removed the stones. You walked the road." As the evening drew to a close, the hall filled with golden light from the sunset. My stepfather's mother arrived, leaning on a cane, smiling proudly. She pressed my hand and said, "I knew you would build something. I just did not know it would be this big." My father was there too, quietly watching, his eyes soft with regret and pride mingled together. For once, the family I chose and the fragments of the family I was born into stood in the same space, not as torment but as witness. I realized then that revenge had never been the true end. Justice was important, but what mattered more was the freedom to create, to live without the weight of stolen years. Linda had tried to take my future, but all she had done was delay it. In the end, what was mine found its way back. Not because of her downfall, but because of my persistence. That night, after the last guest left, and the lights dimmed, Stephen and I stood alone in the vast hall. The echoes of the day lingered around us. He pulled me into his arms and whispered, "You are finally home." And for the first time in my life, I believed it.